Chapter 6, Section 4, Evidence of Evolution. Learning objectives. Describe how the geologic distribution of species today relates to their evolutionary theory. Identify how fossils help document the descent of modern species. Explain what homologous structures and similarities in development suggest about the process of evolutionary change. Describe how molecular biology can be used to trace the process of evolution. And explain what recent research of the Galapagos finches show about natural selection. Darwin recognized the importance of patterns of the distribution of life. The subject of the field called biogeography is the study of where organisms live now and where they and their ancestors lived in the past. Patterns in the distribution of fossils and living species combined with information from geology tell us how modern organisms evolved from their ancestors. To Darwin, the biogeography of the Galapagos bird species suggests that populations of several island species had all evolved from a single mainland species. Over time, a natural selection on different islands selected among individuals with different inherited variations. That caused populations on different islands to evolve into different, but closely related, species. In contrast, Darwin noted the ground-dwelling birds in ecologically similar grasslands in Europe, Australia, and Africa resemble one another, although they were not closely related. Differences in those birds' bodies suggest structures provide evidence that they evolved from different ancestors. But natural selection is similar in similar habitats, led to similar adaptations, such as long legs and feet with toes adapted to running. Two potentially difficulties for Darwin's theory involve the age of the Earth and gaps in the fossil record. Data collected since Darwin's time addresses those difficulties and provided dramatic support for the evolutionary view of life. Darwin knew that for life to have evolved the way he thought it had, Earth must be very old. Hutton and Lyell had argued that the Earth was a lot older than people used to think, but couldn't determine just how old. The discovery of radioactivity and the technique of radioactive dating enabled geologists to establish an age of certain rocks and fossils starting in the early 20th century. If this technique had shown the Earth was young, Darwin's ideas would have been refuted. Instead, radioactive dating indicates that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, plenty of time for evolution by natural selection to take place. Darwin also struggled with what he called the imperfection of the geological record. Paleontologists in Darwin's time hadn't found enough fossils to document the evolution of modern species from their ancestors. But that changed with the discovery of hundreds of fossils, like these ancient whales. Many recent discovered fossils now show clearly how modern species evolved from extinct ancestors. Researchers have found more than 20 related fossils that document the evolution of whales from ancestors that walked on land. Several reconstructions based on fossil evidence are shown on the next two slides. The limb structures of the walking whale suggest that these animals could both swim in shallow water and walk on land. The hind limbs of the Rhodoctus were short and probably not able to bear much weight. Paleontologists think that these animals spent most of their time in the water. Modern whales have reduced pelvic bones and in some cases upper and lower limbs bones. However, these structures no longer play a role in locomotion. By Darwin's time, scientists had noted that the bones in all vertebrate limbs resembled each other to a surprising degree. That resemblance was clear even though some of those limbs were used for crawling, some for climbing, and some for running, and others for flying. Why do the same basic structures appear over and over again in such different purposes? Similar structures like the bones of the vertebrate limbs that are shared by related species and have been inherited from a common ancestor are called homologous structures. Evolutionary theory explains the existence of homologous structures adapted to different purposes as a result of descent with modification from a common ancestor. In this picture, color coding is used to show the homologous bones in the forelimbs of selected modern vertebrates. These limbs evolved from the front limbs of a common ancestor, whose bones resembled those of an ancient fish. If these animals had no recent common ancestor, they would be unlikely to share many common structures. Some homologous structures don't serve important functions. Vestigial structures are inherited from ancestors but have lost most of their original size and function. Recently, researchers in Australia studied a clade of skinks, a type of lizard. This group of skinks has elongated bodies like snakes. Many of them have remains of limbs that they no longer use. Using molecular evidence, the researchers hypothesized relationships among the species of the clade and developed a timeline for the limb size reduction. Body parts that serve similar functions but do not share structure and development are called analogous structures. The wing of a bee and the wing of a bird are examples of analogous structures. Both are used for flight, but they grow and develop from different embryonic tissues. Researchers noticed long ago that early developmental stages of many vertebrates look similar. Recent observations make clear that the same groups of embryonic cells develop in the same order and in similar patterns to produce many homologous tissues and organs. For example, the very different shaped limb bones all develop from the same clump of embryonic cells. Darwin recognized that evolutionary theory offers the most logical explanation for these similarities. Similar patterns of embryonic development provide further evidence that organisms have descent from a common ancestor. The most troublesome missing information for Darwin had to do with inheritance. Darwin had no idea how heredity worked, and he was deeply worried that this lack of knowledge might prove fatal to his theory. Today, genetics provides some of the strongest evidence supporting evolutionary theory. A long series of discoveries from Mendel to Watson and Crick in genomics helped explain how evolution works. At the molecular level, overwhelming similarities in the genetic code of all organisms, along with homologous genes and molecules, provide evidence of common descent. One way to gather evidence for evolutionary change is to observe natural selection in action. But is it possible to observe natural selection happening in nature? Darwin didn't think so because he thought evolutionary change always happens very slowly. We see nothing of these slow changes in progress, he wrote, until the hand of time has marked its lapse of ages. In recent years, however, several biologists have designed experiments that test natural selection in the wild. The longest running and most detailed study of evolution in a natural environment is the ongoing work of Darwin's finches by Peter and Rosemary Grant of Princeton University. The Grants have been studying the finches that live on an island called Daphne Major. That tiny slab of volcanic rock is home to a total finch population of a few hundred individuals. That's enough birds to provide plenty of data, but not so many to be unmanageable. Manageable, of course, is a relative term. What the Grants have been doing for more than 40 years is pretty amazing. They have regularly captured, identified, and measured every single individual bird on that island. When new birds hatch, the Grants note their parents and tag the infant birds to add them to their list of known individuals. Meanwhile, the Grants and their assistants have also counted and measured all of the different kinds of seeds the birds depend on for food. They even created their own device to measure the hardiness of those seeds. The result of the many studies has been fascinating. They just look at a very small part of one study here. The Grants' data showed that there is lots of heritable variation in beak size and the shape of finches populations. But is that variation related to differential survival and reproduction? Luck was on the Grants' side because during their study, a severe drought hit the islands. Plants produced fewer seeds, so the number of seeds dropped steadily. This is where things got interesting. As the drought continued, the birds ate the smaller and softer seeds first. So over time, only the largest, hardiest seeds remained. Many birds starved, and the total number of birds on the island fell. but the grants data showed that certain birds were more likely to survive than others. Individuals with largest beaks had higher evolutionary fitness. Drought caused the average beak size in the finch population to change dramatically over just a few years. This amazing study supported two important hypotheses. The grants documented that natural selection takes place in wild finch populations frequently and sometimes rapidly. One of the grant's colleagues calculated that it might take no more than 12 to 20 such droughts to change the bird's beak size enough to transform one species into another. Also, this work showed the importance of variation in providing raw material on which natural selection can operate. Variation within a species increases a population's ability to adapt and survive environmental change. If the finch population hadn't had enough variation in beak size when the drought started, they would not have been able to adapt and change.